My friends, please do keep that passage open in front of you as we're talking this morning, and let's bow our heads in prayer. Heavenly Father, we shall be talking about families in conflict, and as we sit in this building this morning, some of us come into that category. And so I ask, Lord, that as we look at your word, your inspired word, that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts may be acceptable to you, because you're our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Today, as we've been following through this series of studies in Abraham, later Abraham, under the general umbrella of faith, living the adventure, we come to an uncomfortable point in the life of Abraham. And our topic for this morning is families at war. And we have a good example here in Genesis chapter 13. Maybe you'd like to take the notes on the back of your sheet, and you'll find they match pretty much what I'm going to be displaying up here, and you can fill in any blanks that you need to. But first of all, I'd like to take you to this incident that happened in 1979. It's a wedding. And it's a wedding much like any other wedding. Except, can you see the couple who are getting married there? We haven't changed a bit, have we? I want to take you to that event and to something that happened shortly afterwards. Rosie and I had been married for a month or so, and, well, life was just wonderful. I had... what are you laughing at? I had a good job. I was lecturing at the university. We had a very nice house, if a bit small, but it was our house. And wonder of wonders, I had a wife. And life was rosy. Well, life was rosy, actually, but you get the idea. Until it came to putting out the rubbish. And that was Rosie's job. And I came home from work one day. The bin was full to overflowing with mess before the days of recycling. Waste paper baskets were filling up, and it was Friday, and the bin men had been and gone. And I said to Rosie, "Why haven't you put the bins out?" And she said to me, "I forgot." And I said, "You forgot, eh? Surely you know the bin man comes on a Friday." And she said to me, "Well, you could see they needed doing, so why didn't you do it?" I said, "Why? Because it's your job, that's why." Exit stage left, slam door. Guys, that incident took me utterly by surprise. It's obviously not taking you by surprise, but there you go. And my logic, I'm not proud of it, but my logic at the time was, I'm the husband in this relationship, therefore I must be right. Now, okay, you may laugh at my stupidity and my insensitivity, but let's just recognise that some of us are not laughing. Some of us have been on the receiving end of that sort of behaviour for years and years, and you know the pain that comes with it. The pain of being shouted at, of being brushed aside, of being regarded as a nobody in your own home. And God knows that too. He knows the pain that you suffer, and the sense of frustration and alienation, of loneliness that comes with it. And I am so grateful that God gave me a wife who will stand up for herself. And that mutuality has been a cornerstone of our marriage. It has been something I have constantly been able to rely on and often needed to hear. And in our studies on Abraham today, we're going to discover some family conflict and Abraham's approach to resolving it, which I'm pleased to tell you is rather different from what mine was in 1979. You see, and here's the first thing, you'll find this in your notes. All families experience conflict, without exception, virtually. What is different, however, is the ways that we react to it and resolve it. For some people, outright battle is entirely normal. I remember about that time, while we were living in Swansea, my surprise to see a fiery Welsh couple discuss who was going to do the washing up. That was just the way they related. But when the discussion was over, they just got on with it and they were perfectly happy with each other. For others, however, it was silent warfare. If I can't have my way, I'm not going to talk to you. If I can't have my way, I'm not going to have sex with you. If I can't have my way, you're not going to have the money you need this month. And it's using subtle forms of manipulation to get your own way. And the warfare is silent. On the surface, everything is hunky-dory, but underneath, it's a completely different story. And I want us to spot this morning how the Old Testament conveys its message, because this will help us understand what God is saying through the scriptures in this passage. All it does here is it takes two people and it puts them alongside each other and then spills a story about what happened in their lives and leaves us to draw our own conclusions. And the Bible does this often. It does it with Adam and Eve, with David and Jonathan, with Samson and Delilah, with Jacob and Esau. Here it's Abraham and Lot. And there is a stark contrast between them. In every respect, Lot compares unfavourably with Abraham as his behaviour simply spills out. Abraham walked by faith. Lot walked by sight. He trusted in his wits and what he could see. Abraham was generous and magnanimous to a fault. Lot just looked after number one. Abraham set his sights on reaching the city that God had called him to. Lot made his home in the nearest place where he could make a quid or two. Abraham accepted the tough option because that's what God had called him to. Lot opted for the easy route. So, what were the seeds that caused this particular family conflict between these two men who are painted so differently in Genesis chapter 13? Seeds are wonderful things, aren't they? You give them the right conditions and they'll just grow. So it is with the seeds of conflict. Give it the right conditions and sooner or later it will erupt. So what were those conditions? Well, we can see that perhaps there was partial obedience in Abraham's life. Didn't God tell Abraham to leave his father's household and set his course for a city that was yet to come? Isn't that right? That's what we discovered last week, week before. Okay, then what was Lot doing there? Lot was Abraham's nephew. He was part of his father's household. And there could be any number of explanations that we can come up with for Lot being part of Abraham's party. Maybe Lot was Abraham's favourite nephew. They just got on well together. And in a moment of weakness, Abraham said, well, okay, you come with me. Or maybe Lot was on the receiving end of the sort of family pressure that I've described earlier on. And as a son, he wanted to get out of the family home. So he said to Abraham, can I come with you? And Abraham said, okay, yeah, come on. Now, we're not told, but for whatever reason, Lot was still in Abraham's party. And we can surmise that there's some partial obedience here. The second thing I notice is I want to ask the question, was it that they wanted, even Abraham wanted an easy life at other people's expense? Didn't Abraham have the option of trusting God for his income, but chose to go down to Egypt? That's what we looked at last week, Abraham's behaviour and his lying in Egypt. Why does Genesis talk about Abraham going down to Egypt. Not geographically, it seems it's telling us that spiritually and morally, because they didn't have nicely framed and worked out maps that we do, where north is always up. So why did the verb to go down get used here? Well, it's interesting that when we see this verb used elsewhere in the Old Testament, it often indicates some kind of spiritual decline or a departure from God's plan. A good example, actually, is Jonah. In the book of Jonah, you know about Jonah and the whale, except it wasn't a whale, it was a fish. When God called Jonah, it said, Jonah, get up, arise, and go to Nineveh, the heathen city, and preach against it. But what Jonah did was, he tried to escape on a boat in virtually the opposite direction. And the narrator describes it like this. He went down to the port in Tarshish. He went down to the dock where he found the ship. He went down into the ship. Once he was on the ship, he went down into the belly of the ship. And then he went down into a deep sleep. And if you read the Hebrew text over and over again, it's he went down, he went down, he went down, he went down. And it was when this man was at rock bottom that God got to him. And he said, Jonah, get up. And here I think is the same sort of thing happening. If you look at verse 1 of chapter 13, so Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife. And it seems that the narrator is framing this in such a way that he's giving us a hint that what Abraham is doing here is he's beginning to get back on track with God. Egypt was a spiritual and a geographical diversion, and now he's coming back into the centre of God's plan. So maybe Abraham had wanted an easier life, and that's what took him to Egypt, and now he's coming back. Or maybe one of the seeds of conflict was Abraham's wealth. And it was his resources that sparked the conflict. It certainly exposed Lot to the high life in Egypt. And may have ignited in this young man a desire for easy riches. They also acquired servants in Egypt, one of whom was Hagar, that proved a particular difficulty later on. So maybe it was his wealth and his prosperity that became a snare to him. Richard Foster, some time ago, wrote a book about 3 particular snares that Christians face called Money, Sex and Power. That's the title of the book, and I recommend it if you've never read it. And about money, he says this. Without question, money has taken on a sacred character in our world. And it would do us good to find ways to defame it, to defile it, to trample it under our feet. So step on it, yell at it, laugh at it, list it way down your list of priorities, certainly far below friendship and cheerful surroundings, and engage in the most profane act of all. Give it away. Maybe it was his wealth that was a snare. So here are the seeds in the background of the conflict that we see erupting in Genesis 13. And so now let's look at the events themselves and say, well, why did this particular conflict occur? And the first thing I want to suggest to you is that here in Genesis 13 we see an absolutely classic clash of wills. It can happen between husband and wife, between parents and children, in Abraham's case, an uncle and a nephew. And our wills clash when we want to assert our independence. And there are usually one of 2 motives when this happens. It's usually either what I want and what you want are different, and I'm not going to give up my claim, so I'm going to be the winner and you're going to be the loser. Or else, what I want and you want are the same, but we can't both have it. And that was the issue here in Genesis 13. Both needed to live together in this area, but because of initially because of lack of resources, but latterly because of conflict, they couldn't get on together. And that alerts us to an interesting fact about conflict. But there are 2, broadly speaking, different kinds of conflict. There's simple and compound conflicts, and here we see both. A simple conflict is where there's one isolated issue at stake. And that's what we have here on the surface. Too little land and too many people. And this kind of conflict is often resolved by talking it through. So long as both parties don't rely on their position, I'm the head of the household, I'm the boss, I'm the clever one. And we'll see how Abraham behaved in a moment. Often that kind of issue can be resolved by talking together, perhaps with a third party. But then there's also, compound conflict, where the issue facing the two conflicting parties is only one of many unresolved hurts and feelings that lie behind it. So this particular conflict is the last straw that is breaking the camel's back. And here in Genesis 13 we have both. And they are stacked up like kindling, waiting for a spark. Rob Parsons, the leader of Care for the Family and the author, he was a solicitor. And he tells a story about a man who was filing for divorce over being asked to make his own dinner, which sounds absolutely ridiculous. But when he dug into it, you can probably guess, that was only the last of a catalogue of unresolved conflicts that finally resulted in the breakup of his marriage. And each conflict had been stuffed under the carpet, each conflict had been ignored, each conflict had been put someplace else. We'll come back to it later, but the comeback never happened. And finally, one thing broke his back. Here in Genesis 13, we have simmering hostility between the herdsmen of Abraham and of Lot, which erupted in violence. One small conflict building on another. And they have a cumulative effect in our souls. And I'm going to say something that might surprise you. In this regard, I'd like to alert us to the tragedy of a row-free marriage. Now that may be a phrase that is unfamiliar to you. The tragedy of a row-free marriage. Because surely in marriage our goal should be to have everything blissfully peaceful and calm. Have you ever seen a marriage where there's never an argument? All their conflict is blissfully resolved, never a crossword between husband and wife, parents and children. It's theoretically possible, honestly. I don't think I've ever truly seen one. I've seen couples who've never rowed. And I believe them. Not because I've been a fly on the wall, but because of the way they behave, the way they relate to each other. The husband says, "We're going to do this today, aren't we?" Wife says, "Oh yes, dear." At home, she can't open a jar of jam, so he says very condescendingly, "Oh, come here, I'll do it." He raids her handbag for any secrets he can find. He belittles her behind the front door. And what's the message? The message is, you're a wimp, you're weak, you're weedy. And she ends up crushed in spirit, wearing a smile on the outside in order to keep up appearances, but crushed and broken on the inside. Oh, they've never rowed, but conflict has never been resolved. And the consequence? He doesn't respect her, and she lives in two worlds, a public world where everything's okay, and a private world where she dare not even admit to herself the bitterness and the hatred and the anger that she feels towards her husband. And my friend, if you're in that situation this morning, can I say as kindly as I can, God knows your pain. He is not ignorant of what you're going through. Because it doesn't have to be that way round. Sometimes it's not husband abusing wife, sometimes it's wife abusing husband, but it's usually us men who are to blame. So are there principles here about resolving conflict that we can take into our marriages, into our families, into our workplace? I believe there are. And so let's look at Abraham's principles for piecing together. No, that's not an English word, but I think it fits, don't you? Let's make up a new one. The first thing I notice is there in verse 8. Abraham took some action. He started the peacemaking process. And unless someone is brave enough to do this, the conflict usually just rumbles on. Look at verse 8. So Abraham said to Lot, let's not have any more of this. Let's not have this quarrelling between you and me or between our herdsmen, for we're brothers. So Abraham took action. He didn't let it ride. And then I noticed he was clear about what the real problem was. Well, the problem was the lack of land, that's obvious. And there's quarrelling between their men, that's obvious. Had the herdsmen come to agreement, possibly the whole argument could have been avoided. But unless this behaviour ceased, the family would be permanently torn apart. And knowing the culture of the time, people would be killed. And I'm impressed with Abraham at this point. Because what Abraham does is he names the elephant in the room. And what he says is this: Lot, it's you and me who are at war. Yes, our herdsmen are at loggerheads too, but we can't blame them. They're taking the lead from us. They know we can't stand the sight of each other. They're just following suit. It's there in verse 8. Abraham says it's you and me who are at war. So let's not have any more of this. He's very clear about the direction that he should follow. And then I noticed something really interesting. Abraham refused to draw strength from his position. Look at verse 8. He said, for we are brothers. Now, to borrow strength from your position means to use your superiority as an argument to attempt to win the conflict and make the other person the loser. It's the win-lose scenario. When we borrow strength from our positions, we hear words like, I'm the senior partner in this business. Or I'm an expert in this area. Or I'm the husband. Or I am your father. I can't do it like Darth Vader does. Abraham said in verse 8, we are brothers. Of course they're not. They're uncle and nephew. But Abraham was talking about himself as if he was on an equal footing with Lot, in order to create some common ground for there to be a more equal and adult discussion. He refused to borrow strength from his position, even though that was his right. And therefore we notice that he didn't insist on his rights. Is not the whole land before you, Lot? If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. Now, of course, in the ancient Near East, being the uncle made him the senior member of the family here, and he would have the priority in major decision-making like this. And that would be an unquestioned part of their culture. But he says to Lot, isn't the whole land before you, so let's part company. If you go one way, I will go the other. Abraham put himself at a disadvantage for the sake of his family. He could have chosen to go any route he pleased, but he gave that option to Lot. And we know what happened. It's there in verse 10. Lot looked up and he saw the whole plain of Jordan. Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord. It was like the land of Egypt towards Zoar. That's the narrator giving us a hint that this is going back to Egypt kind of mentality. And then he says, this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Again, a word from the narrator. It's a chilling reminder that Lot was walking straight into trouble. I do love the way the Old Testament spins its stories, don't you? And how wise the Spirit of God was in just giving us the narrative without lots of analysis so that we can draw our own conclusions. So let's ask how that might have panned out. What were the consequences of Abraham's costly action in this regard? And we're meant to ask this because what we see is God blessing and prospering Abraham in verse 14. Lot chose the fertile plain And Abraham is going to do differently. And listen to the Lord's language, verse 14. The Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had departed from him, note, Abraham, lift up your eyes from where you are and look. North, south, east and west, presumably including the land that Lot had just headed off into. All the land that you see I will give you, and to your offspring forever. It's another unconditional promise. And I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth. So if anyone is daft enough to think they can count the dust, and there's a lot of dust, then your offspring could be counted. Now Abraham, just go, walk through the land. Walk the length and breadth of it. Because I am giving it to you. So in this scenario, Lot took out of selfishness. God gave out of generosity. Abraham acted in faith. Lot put number one first. Abraham bore the cost, but also won the victory. But that's another story. Let's bow our heads in prayer.